Welcome everyone, thanks for being here. And let me welcome our speaker tonight, Howard Robinson. He's a professor of philosophy at Central European University and a senior fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at Rutgers, as well as a research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. And he's been a stalwart defender of dualism in the philosophy of mind for the past 40 years or so, and has also argued for idealism in metaphysics. If you're interested in his survey of the state of play in philosophy of mind, please look at his latest book called From the Knowledge Argument to Mental Substance, Resurrecting the Mind. I'm going to give a short summary of the paper, followed by whatever reflections Howard may have, and then we'll open up for discussion. So our topic today is Aristotelian dualism and hylomorphism in philosophy of mind. And according to Howard, there are two ways to bring back Aristotle into contemporary philosophy of mind. One way is unfashionable, but almost certainly right, and it concerns the immateriality of the intellect. And the other is fashionable, but almost certainly wrong. And that's the attempt to use hylomorphism to solve the mind-body problem. The paper deals with three big topics. The one concerns the compatibility of Aristotle with modern science. The second concerns forms of contemporary hylomorphism. And the third big topic is the immateriality of the intellect. I'm going to rush through the first part, which concerns Aristotle's own hylomorphism. Here, Howard says that the significance of Aristotle's own theory depends essentially on a kind of downward causation, which explicitly rules out closure under physics. There are two general approaches here to Aristotle's four causes when it comes to explaining nature. The first is that, in principle, efficient causes are enough to explain the distribution and motion of matter in the physical world. And in an alternative conception of Aristotle's theory, we need all four causes. And although interpreting Aristotle is extraordinarily difficult, Howard believes that the second approach is much more plausible. There is no doubt that substantial forms are meant to be out there in the world, not just ways that we conceptualize reality. But if the physical world is closed under physics or the mechanics of Aristotle's elements, then these forms do not influence the course of events. They are just there to answer to our substance concepts. Insofar as these entities make no difference to the location and movement of matter, I do not see how they can occupy the foundational position that Aristotle attributes to substantial forms. Now I'm going to move on. There are lots of interesting questions in this part of the paper, but I'm going to move on and switch to contemporary hylomorphism. So one idea here is that one can resurrect Aristotelian forms by identifying them with physical structure or organization. Structure, uncontroversially, has important explanatory force, and if form can be identified with structure, then it is reinstated. Now, structure can mean two very different things. One can think of structures as some sort of fundamental phenomena in the ontology of nature. Alternatively, one can think of them as a mere matter of spatial or spatiotemporal relations combined with causal relations. Now, in the second sense, it seems quite obvious that structure won't do the kind of work that hylomorphists want it to do. One response that hylomorphists sometimes give to this worry is to distinguish between static and dynamic structures. The examples of static structures are things like rocks, whereas dynamic structures are things like organisms, flames, and fountains. As the paper says, the fact that flames and fountains are included should cause suspicion. These things might be dubbed living, but not in a literal sense. They are surely mechanical processes, meaning by this that maintenance of the structure through change of parts comes wholly through the interaction between the things that come to be the parts. The structure does not have an independent influence. If the standard modern scientific theories are correct, the same applies to living organisms. So the structure is a byproduct of the interaction of the parts in dynamic as well as in static structures. As such, structure cannot be deemed fundamental in a metaphysical sense, whereas it would have to be in order for it to count as genuinely Aristotelian. In a footnote, Howard considers the response that structure could be fundamental and not unpegged in terms of spatial plus causal relations. If two conditions are met, space is construed relationally, and the relations in question count as kinds of structure. But the worry is that on this view, the resulting structures are too prolific and overlapping to do the job of individuating objects. So it seems that structure in general won't give us hylomorphism in anything remotely like Aristotle's sense. Now, another strategy is to deny closure under physics somehow. One way to deny it is to go for the dappled view of nature, championed by Nancy Cartwright and John Dupre in the Philosophy of Science. As Dupre writes, cats and dogs, mountains and molehills, I want to argue, exist in just as metaphysically robust a sense as do electrons and quarks, assuming, of course, that the latter exist at all. What I want to deny, therefore, is that there is any interesting sense in which ontological priority must be accorded to the homogeneous stuff out of which bigger things are made. This view, Howard believes, does not give us any priority to cats and dogs. They are just real like anything else. There is no suggestion that they hold the disparate ontologies of science together, giving the macro world a unifying role and therefore a priority. And he makes a similar point concerning alleged parallels between hylomorphism and the so-called new mechanist philosophy in the philosophy of science. But I'm going to skip over that to be able to get through the whole paper. The third form of modern hylomorphism that is discussed concerns specifically the philosophy of mind. Here we begin with a reminder about the so-called knowledge argument in the philosophy of mind. It has been believed ever since the 17th century that it is a complete mystery how or why the state of the gray matter in our heads should give rise to vivid conscious experiences, and why a particular state should give rise to a red sensation, another to a green one. In a classic way of articulating this problem, one is to imagine someone who, for whatever reason, has never experienced chromatic colors, but who has a complete scientific knowledge of the visual system associated with perception of such colors. It would seem that such a person would not know what it is like to perceive colors, even though they knew all the physical processes involved. Consciousness is not, therefore, a physical state. What is the relevance of hylomorphism to this issue? How does it help if one asserts that the soul is the form of the body? Now, one suggestion is that hylomorphism supports the inactivism of James Gibson and Alvin Noe. Perceiving is a way of acting. Perception is not something that happens to us. It is something that we do. The natural response to this formula, according to the paper, is to say that it is treating the experience of perceiving as a mode of behavior. What else could a way of acting, something we do, be? I can attend to, notice, interpret things that I see, but when I open my eyes and I'm facing in a certain direction, there is a lot that is experientially imposed on me too. The theory cannot be behaviorism plus without the plus capturing all the traditional problems. So going inactivist via some sort of modern hylomorphism doesn't provide us anything new to problems like the knowledge argument. Another suggestion could be that, like the new mechanistic philosophy, hylomorphism offers a new conception of complementary, if not equivalent, alternative conceptions of organizational emergence. I think this approach is really avoiding the problems that face the philosophy of mind. Spooky emergence is entirely concerned with the emergence of consciousness, not with how atoms form molecules and the like, but no explicit mention of consciousness is made in the account. The hard issue of emergence is ignored by talking about how new properties arise in essentially non-controversial cases. So the way that hylomorphism could be relevant in the ontology of nature in general doesn't seem to be applicable in the context of the philosophy of mind. And finally, the final topic concerns the immateriality of the intellect. That's supposed to be the part of Aristotle's philosophy of mind that is relevant today. Aristotle argued the intellect must be immaterial because if it were material, it could not receive all forms. Just as the eye, because of its particular physical nature, is sensitive to light but not to sound, and the ear to sound and not to light, so if the intellect were in a physical organ, it could be sensitive only to a restricted range of physical things, but this is not the case, for we can think about any kind of material object as well as non-material objects. As it does not have a material organ, its activity must be essentially immaterial. The paper considers 5 ways to argue for the immateriality of the intellect in a contemporary context. One is the Chinese room argument by John Searle. Another is cognitive phenomenology. The third is the sheer counterintuitiveness of the idea that we are thinking machines or syntactic engines. That is, that one can give an account of meaningful communication and understanding by invoking only the physical structure of symbols and the consequent rules of their operation. The fourth issue is the frame problem in the theory of artificial intelligence, and the fifth concerns troubles with connectionism and deep learning as models of the human mind. Rather than going through each of these in detail, we can come back to any of these during the Q&A. I'd like to focus on the argument that the paper finally assembles. We're going to need two concepts to set that up. One is sphexischness. The sphex, which is apparently a type of wasp, likes to paralyze crickets and drag it to its nest to have something for its larvae to feed on. So it paralyzes the cricket, it drags it to the nest, then it goes inside the nest, fiddles around there, and then comes back out and drags the cricket inside. Now, this seems to be a paradigm example of intelligent behavior with respect to a certain goal, but it turns out that if the situation changed a little bit, for example, if you drag the cricket's body away while the wasp is inside, what the wasp does when it comes back out is that it drags the cricket back to its original position, then it goes back into the nest again, fiddles around, and then comes out and tries to drag it in. So it seems that the cricket's nervous system contains a specific algorithm of doing things. And although that algorithm is aimed at fulfilling a certain goal, the cricket is unable to adapt to changes, to small changes in the context of
the wasp.
Oh, sorry, the wasp. Thank you. The cricket is just lying there paralyzed. The wasp is unable to adapt to changes in the context. Its behavior is not plastic, if you will. It's just running some specific algorithm. So it seems like that there's some sort of insensitivity at work here, which has to do with the mechanical way that this algorithm is being deployed. The second concept we're going to need is the frame problem. Here's the gist of it from the Stanford Encyclopedia. How could a robot limit the scope of the propositions it must reconsider in the light of its actions? In a sufficiently simple robot, this doesn't seem like much of a problem. Surely the robot can simply examine its entire database of propositions one by one and work out which require modification. But if we imagine that our robot has near human level intelligence and is therefore burdened with an enormous database of facts to examine every time it as much as spins a motor, such a strategy starts to look computationally intractable. Now, here's the argument for the immateriality of intellect. Any physical thinking machine is a syntactic engine. Any syntactic engine, however complex, is necessarily somewhat sphexish. Therefore, any physical thinking machine is necessarily somewhat sphexish. Sphexischness and the frame problem are essentially the same thing, the same kind of lack of flexibility. Therefore, any physical thinking machine will face the frame problem. Abductive and similar forms of thought are necessary to avoid the frame problem. Abductive thinking and similar forms involve being a semantic engine. Therefore, avoiding these problems involves not being a physical thinking machine. Human beings can think their way out of these problems. Therefore, human thinking is not done in a physical thinking machine. The blue propositions are logical consequences, and the black ones are the premises. And the conclusion is that a physical system, qua physical, cannot have a teleological instinct. It can have evolved to reach a certain objective, like sphex, but innovative programming from its own resources could only be random. Teleological thinking and being a semantic engine are the same thing, and without this irreducibly semantic engine component, all that is available for problem solving and thought are number crunching, pattern recognition, and fortuitous trial and error, analogous to Darwinian evolution. I think I'm going to stop here, and I apologize to Howard for reducing this extremely rich yet highly focused paper to a few slides. I only wanted to provide a few signposts to people, to both those who have read it and those who have not. I'm going to hand it over now to you if you have anything to add, and if not, then we're just going to open up for discussion.
Yep. One thing I think I would say is this. First of all, no apologies are needed. That was a very clear account of my argument. One thing I think that you didn't quite say was, well, the difference between a syntactic and a semantic engine is. And that's an important distinction. I don't know who introduced the jargon, but Dennett certainly uses it a lot. What he means by syntactic engine is some machine that only works according to the, as it were, physical things that's doing it. Or you could think of it slightly more abstractly. It manipulates symbols without the symbols having any particular meaning. So it's like an algebra or a logical system uninterpreted. A semantic engine is one which, by knowing what the things mean, can do things in a flexibility that you couldn't get out of purely abstract operations on the symbol qua symbol, as opposed to meaningful idea. And my suggestion is that it's as obvious that when we have this discussion, we're responding to what we think the other party means, as it is that when somebody stands on our foot, we're responding to what it actually feels like. And though you may be able to imitate that in a machine to some extent, you can never completely imitate it, because we make the moves we do on the basis, I mean, you've got to have this machinery in your head. Goodness knows, embodiment is the real mind-body problem as far as I'm concerned, why you need the stuff at all. But the operating on the basis of meaning, understanding, which a computer doesn't do, because there's more to understanding than knowing how to manipulate symbols according to rules. You've got to know what those symbols mean. And that's being a semantic engine. And even Dennett acknowledges that he doesn't really see how just storing up rooms for symbols, even in the sort of computation, the connectionist way, is going to do that, which is an interesting concession in a way. So that's all I want to say. But otherwise, thank you very much for the account of what I was saying.
This is just a question about the what you said about perception and action. So do we really have to understand action and bodily movement? So I would say that there's a question about whether perception is a passive state or whether perception is a kind of activity which does not require any sort of behaviorism. Like when I'm making decisions, and you know, one can give a teleological account of decision making, like I'm making decision in order to settle what to do or what to believe, and this is a kind of teleological actional process, but I can do it, you know, without any kind of bodily movement. In fact, I don't think that moving my body would help. Sometimes it does when I walk up and down, but I don't think that this is the essential part of it. So okay, so I just wanted to say that you talked about the action perception relationship, and then maybe I misunderstood it, but then you somehow ended up with behaviorism plus something. But I didn't understand, why should it be behaviorism?
I see. I think my claim is this. If it's not behaviorism, then the extra thing you're adding in the action sense is either itself purely mental, or else it's restoring the whole issue of, say, the phenomenal, which is what they're trying to explain away, or should be. That's all. I mean, I don't want to deny, there's various senses in which perceiving is an activity. I mean, you know, you turn and look at a thing, you notice it, you categorize it, all that kind of stuff, you attend to it in perception. You can call those activities, that's all right. But pointing out those features doesn't help you to explain away, so to speak, the hard problem for the philosophy of mind, namely, what do you do with the phenomenal content from a physicalist point of view? That's all I was saying. Is that any use?
No. I agree with that. It's not an answer to the hard problem. But I think that the mental activity passivity problem is interesting, not because it promises you to give an answer to the hard problem. So
no, there are lots of issues in that area.
okay.
I mean, there clearly is a sense in which perception is passive. You know, you're just looking in that direction and what's in front of you hits you in the face, so to speak. But then what you do with it is another matter.
Yes. Okay. I mean, I don't want to go with this. I have views on such issues, but this is indeed, I mean, I didn't mean that it's the hard problem is solved with that. But if you are behaviorist, of course, there is no hard problem.
Sure.
So that, okay, thank you.
We have 3 questions in the Q&A box. The first is from Laszlo Bernat. I would like to ask whether Howard believes that if we combine a syntactic engine and consciousness, it results in human intelligence.
I think the answer to that is no. That's to say, that reminds me of what I think used to be, and perhaps still is, the Dave Chalmers position. You can abstract the consciousness away from the human being and leave you with a zombie. That's to say, something that behaves just as we do, but doesn't have any of the phenomenal thing. And of course, that makes the phenomena epiphenomenal. Now, if what I say about cognitive phenomenology is right, and what I said about the semantic engine stuff is right, actually, there are 2 options here. You might think that pain is epiphenomenal, and so is understanding. So you have almost a kind of parallelism. We work like a machine, but we're actually doing something that machines can't do as well. We're carried along as passengers, conscious passengers, including not merely feeling-y passengers, but thinking-y passengers to this piece of machinery. Now, any kind of epiphenomenalism is a counsel of despair. There's something you can't get rid of and you don't know what to do with. But if you are really a semantic engine, it's actually the understanding that plays a role in what you do. And if there is a frame problem, just adding bare consciousness to what's going on, unless it help the machine to solve its problems, wouldn't overcome the frame problem in any way. So the frame problem is one about, if you're just being a syntactic engine, you wouldn't know what to do next. It would just be too complicated to work out what to do next. Whereas if you understand what you're trying to do, if you understand the meaning of the information you've got, you can sort through things much more quickly. So you couldn't stick a syntactic engine to consciousness and overcome the kind of problems that I'm talking about, if they are problems.
There's another question slightly connected to this by Tamás Pár. We actually often act sphexish. What is Howard's proof that these occasions are insignificant and that we are entirely unsphexish?
I think what I'd want to say there is that if somebody points out to you, come on, you don't have to keep doing that. You'd see what they meant. Now, there's no way of getting that through to something like the WASP, because it's hardwired to do it, and it wouldn't even be aware. It can't even stand back and say, now why on earth am I making a mess of this like this? And I don't know there's any situation in which, in principle, a human being couldn't ask that question, even if they couldn't really answer it because it was just too difficult for them or something. That's not quite the same point to me. Why can't I do this mathematics? Isn't going to help me to be able to do it because I'm no good at that kind of thing. But at least I can see on probably people pointed out to me, and I can understand it. So I'm not sure that we are Svexish in that sense. I don't know how to prove that, but it's. I'd like to hear a case of somebody who was not in a peculiar mental state, not mentally ill or whatever, who just couldn't have something pointed out to them. Now, it's difficult to prove that because, of course, in our case, it would be a more sophisticated case than the wasp case. But I don't think we are Svexish in that way. And that's why I think Svexishness, the frame problem, the Chinese room, all reinforce each other as arguments. They all illustrate what's going wrong.
Thank you. I just I thought that maybe it's better if I try this way. So I hope you can hear me. I'm not sure.
Perfectly well.
Okay. So my question is that I suppose that the wasp is a conscious being, and it seems that nonetheless he or she, I don't know in English which is the best. So it is rigid in its behavior, and why is that? So if consciousness somehow contributes to not being so rigid in behavior, why the wasp still rigid? Why is that?
Okay. I suppose I might try saying, well, it's not a thinking being, just being phenomenally conscious, in so much as a wasp is. I don't know whether wasps are isn't going to help with that. Or you might say, well, there are kinds of case, say, where the wasp will respond to a physical stimulus because it can feel it, so to speak. And there you've got the interesting question of whether the consciousness is playing a role in that case. Now, if I'm right in claiming that it's probably the case that the feeling of the pain plays a role, not the only thing playing the role in how we react, then perhaps if the wasp has a feeling, if it's not just a little robot, and of course the issue of how far down the evolutionary line you go while still thinking it's a conscious being rather than a piece of machinery being trained up that can be conscious later on in evolution, so to speak. Yeah, so it may be consciousness does affect its responses to stimuli, but it doesn't affect it intellectually, such that it can't say what's going wrong here. Then maybe is that roughly
okay
answer?
So you say something like that even though it is conscious, the wasp has no sufficient intellectual power for some reasons, for some other reasons, to harvest this kind of advantage at least in some cases.
Right. It has purely sensory consciousness, shall we say. So it can react to stimuli because of what it feels like, but it doesn't think about them. It only reacts to them in, as it were, automatic-y ways.
And my last question, and I leave it to be at that point, that what kind of, how would you characterize this kind of non-sensory consciousness? What's the gist of this kind of consciousness? So it's not only consciousness, not only sensory consciousness, and I get that it's important with regard to intelligence, but if you could not use the word intelligence or anything like that, what would be the word for describing this additional something which is so reflectivity or something like that? I don't know, but so what would be the word for that additional component? Or
the term of art that's sort of come in and become part of the debate is cognitive phenomenology. So there's something it's like to understand, just as there's something it's like to see, feel, or whatever. And there's something it's like. So the reductionists about this say, yeah, but it's only like what it's like to hear those words. The cognitive phenomenology says, no, it's what it's like to understand them. It's the difference between hearing somebody read something out in a language you don't understand and somebody who can understand that language being read out. They're getting the same sort of noises input, but one is actually experiencing the meaning. And that doesn't just mean that they can join in the conversation by replying. It's something that's actually going on in the experience. And that's the cognitive phenomenology, the experience of understanding. What the experience of half understanding is a more difficult. So somebody like Husserl, I believe, not that I've read much Husserl, but the phenomenologists took that kind of thing as a paradigm of consciousness. And it's really only with Gilbert Ryle's trying to turn everything that's not a perceptual sensation into a dispositional thing, that the idea that you could cope with every kind of propositional attitude operation, so to speak, in a purely functionalist or dispositionalist way came in. And before that, it would have been taken for granted that, it's because you know what I'm meaning as I say this, that you want to make a certain reply to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laci. We have 2 questions via text messages. First is by Frederick Hoverman. For many, if not all thoughts, there seems to have to be some physical embodiment in words uttered or written, for example, for them to be formulated, expressed, and understood. Their physical embodiment appears to be necessarily constitutive of those thoughts, if not sufficient for them to be thoughts. This might seem to locate thoughts spatially. Do you think the thought is spatially located, even though immaterial?
Very good question. It's the kind of question that reminds me of the Scottish preacher's response when asked about the problem of evil. He said, "This is a very serious problem. We must look it squarely in the face and pass on." As I said earlier on, I think the problem of embodiment is the mind-body problem. It's not just the problem of interaction, that's part of it, the mind-body of embodiment, but it's also the question of what role the 2 aspects play, namely the conscious aspect and the realization, in some loose sense of that term, of that process in a living animal. So, what do I want to say in response to that? We do depend upon language in order to articulate our thoughts, in order to have these thoughts to ourselves, more or less, if there's any complexity in the thought. I mean, you can't wonder non-linguistically whether the doctrine of the Trinity is a coherent doctrine, or why it is that Manchester United is such a wonderful football team, or whatever important thoughts you have. So our activity of thinking takes place in time, and of course our writing it down takes place in space. Geach has a good point here, though. He makes the point that when you understand a thought, you understand it as a whole. It's not that as you go through the sentence, you understand each word and then pass on. You somehow grasp what's being said. Presumably the thoughts, as it were, short enough. You get the message, you get the information, rather than getting each bit and then passing on to the next bit. Now, my own view is something like this. Time is a pretty funny object. And the idea that there's just one form of time, physical time. It may be that the four-dimensionalists are right about the physical world in so much as there is a physical world. And the number of kinds of phenomenal time that there might be, goodness knows. So that's an evasive answer, but I can't do any better at the moment. Are you quasi-satisfied with that, Rob?
No, of course I'm satisfied. I have to think about it a bit more, but it's an interesting dilemma. I wonder if it pushes one somewhat in the direction of idealism as a way of resolving that issue of, as it were, the paradox of embodiment.
Yep, that's a line of thought I want to explore. I mean, at the beginning, Danny said that I was a long-time defender of dualism. Strictly speaking, I'm a long-time defender of the notion of mental substance, because the material bit of dualism is something I'm more skeptical about, being of Berkeleyan inclinations. But dualism is the easiest label to use. And in Aristotle's case, Aristotle wasn't an idealist, so it's dualism in his case, yeah. But I did write something in a volume, OUP volume, edited by Zimmerman and Inwagen, I think, called Persons Human and Divine, in which I tried to locate persons outside time altogether, in some sense. And I did write a thing on embodiment in 1988, which you might have read, Rob, I think.
Yes. And the other one.
Yeah, I've not got beyond those thoughts on that area.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
May I briefly enter the discussion? So, Rob, in your original question, you mentioned the utterances or we must express thoughts, formulate thoughts. I mean, if I'm not speaking or reading or listening to someone, just thinking, then is it clear that there is some sort of physical, there's an underlying physical reality there corresponding to my thoughts?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Even if you are saying things, as it were, to yourself in your mind, that's not obviously a physical thing that's going on, because it's in the privacy of a mind where the privacy doesn't seem to be a physical privacy, so to speak. It's more metaphysically challenging kind of privacy. So even if you were having to formulate, I'm not entirely clear though what your thoughts would be if there weren't some kind of formulation, as it were, even in your mind's eye, of using words or images. I mean, if there weren't words or images, what would the thought be? How would you have identified what the thought is, even in your mind's eye?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yes, that's a fair point. But I mean, sure, there should be images or inner speech or something like that. But how is that physical by definition?
Yes, no, that's I agree with that. That is questionably physical. But for many thoughts, we only seem to be able to formulate them when we do embody them physically. So I'm not saying it is true of all thoughts. I mean, that was in my original question. I wasn't wanting to suggest all thoughts, but for some thoughts, it seems essential that we give them a physical embodiment.
I think there's two kinds of embodiment here, isn't there? What you might call empirical embodiment, i.e. in images or even words said to oneself. And then there's the physical embodiment in public physical forms, in writing or sounds made out loud. In both cases, there's some kind of embodiment of the thought. In either case is it the pure thought, so to speak, if there is such a thing as that. And,
We have a couple of other written questions. The first is from Shivananda Sharma. Is there any scope to say that Aristotle's philosophy of mind is compatible with the Vedanta tradition in Indian philosophy, which posits that mind and matter are grounded in an ultimate reality called Brahman, which is both the ground of being and the whole of being? I apologize for not being able to characterize the Vedanta tradition adequately. I'm still trying to research this myself. But as far as I understand, Brahman is taken as both the efficient cause and the material cause of all existing things, both physical and non-physical.
well, there's a serious problem to my trying to answer that question, namely that I don't really know anything about Indian philosophy. So I can't say what the parallel would be. What it reminds me of, as you put it, is something much more like the Kantian noumenal world, which lies behind both the physical and the mental reality, though I think on some readings of Kant, the mind is part of the noumenal world. I'm not quite sure how that works, if anybody is. But I think Aristotle doesn't have the notion of a completely different, higher sort of thing lying behind it. You might almost get that more in Plato with the form of the good, or Neoplatonism with the one, something like that. But I really, I've read virtually a bit of Buddhist logic 40 years ago, I think. His History of Logic has a chapter on Indian logic, but I can't help you there because I just don't know enough. Sorry.
Isn't the famous active intellect in the anima relevant here?
You mean relevant to being the kind of thing that lies behind everything?
Yes.
I don't think the active intellect, I mean, the prime mover and the active intellect, the relationship between those two things is, I think, not clear in the text, though it's natural to think of them as having something to do with each other. And then, of course, you've got the issue that came up, particularly with the Arab philosophers, whether the active intellect is something we each have one of, or whether it's just one thing up there, or even the potential intellect just being one. Some of the Arabs thought. But I don't think there's any idea. I mean, the one keeps the world turning, so to speak, but there's no creation story, and there's no idea that it makes any of these things. Nothing is ever made, as it were. Everything's been there eternally, and God just keeps the machinery working. So I wouldn't think the active intellect was playing the same role. And the active intellect doesn't have any particular mystical properties, I don't think, which I suppose the Brahmin idea does. And it's sort of like the Neoplatonist one, as it were, almost unintelligible in itself, that kind of thing. But I have no right even to say that.
All right, thank you. Another question from Jeremy Skripek. I'm sorry if I messed up your name. I want to see whether I have Professor Robinson's argument correct. Is the main critique of Aristotelian hylomorphism this, that if form or structure is anything more robust than mere spatial and causal relations between an object's parts, then hylomorphism violates the causal closure of the microphysical? And if we're going to challenge causal closure, we might as well be dualists. Thinking of the soul as the form of the body doesn't actually offer any explanatory benefit. Is that the argument?
Partly. I mean, what I mainly object to, I mean, as a dualist, I'm not keen on the closure of the physical, but I don't mind the closure of the world and the physics in context where the issue of mind isn't there. So take any non-minded thing, including, say, a vegetable, a tree, or just the operation of the rest of the world. I'm quite happy to think that everything supervenes on what the physical particles or the quantum field or whatever it is doing. Interactionism with the mind is another issue. And I think if hylomorphism is right, you couldn't even say for an ordinary physical object or a vegetable that the world was, they operated the way it did because of the properties just of its bits. You'd always have to have a downward causation. The kind of thing it is makes those things do what they do, provided it's the kind of thing that they can do. So it's always a top-down thing. The reason why I don't think it helps with the mind-body problem is therefore not entirely straightforward. I don't know that, I mean, in saying the soul is the form of the body, one is trying to apply the same model as one applies to, you know, the form of the oak tree to animals and to human beings. And as it doesn't work in the case of the oak tree, I'm not sure what it is you're transferring over. But people, there's a whole category of people who like to appeal to it now in the belief that you avoid the mind-body problem as supposedly it has existed since Descartes. And that's always to do with the status of private consciousness. And my point is that just talking hylomorphically isn't going to tell you what to do with that. That's my real point. And people who do tend to be influenced by Wittgenstein, a lot of kind of Thomists of a certain generation, or the Anscombe-Geach category of people. I think Wittgenstein's anti-private language argument is right, so there isn't this private realm at all. And that's when I think you start getting into something that's very difficult to discern from a kind of informal behaviorism. Is that too garbled, or is that any kind of answer to what you were asking?
That's very helpful, thank you, he says. We have no open questions right now, so please feel free to raise your hands or type anything else you might want to add. My question would be suppose we go along with Aristotle and accept that the intellect is immaterial. I mean, I take it that by itself doesn't make us Aristotelians.
No, I think Descartes thought the same thing.
Right. So is what you're saying that what is living from Aristotle's philosophy is pretty much the same that Descartes was onto? Well,
if you remember, anybody read it probably remembers that I say at the beginning that I think people are wrong when they say that Descartes abandoned Aristotle's philosophy of mind and created a dualism. What the 17th century did was abandon Aristotle's philosophy of physical nature by making physical nature operating according to its own self-sufficient laws, which is just the opposite of the top-down hylomorphic explanation you've got in Aristotle. And so you've then got the problem, what do you do with the mind? So if you think as Descartes does, and Aristotle did, that the human mind is not a physical thing, you've then got to try and answer the question of how it relates to the physical thing in a different way from the way Aristotle answered it, by saying, you know, roughly speaking, it's the form of the body. He didn't directly say that about the intellect, though. For Aquinas, I think the form is the same as the intellect. Aristotle doesn't say anything as direct as that. So it's the change that Descartes made in Aristotle's philosophy of mind is much less than the change that happened about that period, including in Descartes, to the picture of how the physical world works. And it's just wrong to say that Aristotle Descartes invented this dualism and abandoned the perfectly plausible theory of mind that was going before. So I think that's the important point. Also, Descartes, I mean, one of the things that's, in my view, completely inadequate about Aristotle's philosophy of mind is that he thinks you can have a straightforwardly material account of perception. So perceptual consciousness, or problems arising from it, doesn't seem to loom large, if looming at all, in his. Now, people argue a lot about what his theory of perception really is. In some sense, you take on the form of what you're perceiving. On the other hand, you don't need an immaterial organ to do it. So it's not taking on the form like taking on a thought. And some people like Sarabji seem to think you just get, you look at a red object, you get, as it were, a red image in your eye. That's what it takes in. Other people, I think, like Victor Kasten says this kind of thing somewhere, it's like a flow of information, which seems to me a very anachronistic way of looking at it. And Descartes, in his earlier phase, or perhaps even remained a bit inconsistent about this, Hanoch would know this better than I do, how to handle this one. At some point, he seems to think that perceptual things can be taken physically. It's only intellect that can't. But then, of course, he came round to the view, or often speaks in the way that suggests that it's the experience that's private and not just physical. So that the move and the empiricists are much more consistent on this, I think. You know, Locke, you just can't see why this grey matter should give rise to anything like an experience of red. And that there's the absolute distinction there on the imagistic level. And then you get this, what I think is a disastrous move in the empiricists. You start to develop an imagistic theory of thought, where thoughts become nothing other than not manipulating physical symbols like now, but manipulating images. You get an associationist psychology. That doesn't do either. So that's the move, in my view. You don't get that in Descartes, I don't think. You get it in Hume. Berkeley, I'm not so sure. Because Berkeley's second volume of the Principles, explaining the self, he lost in a coach on the Alps, and for some reason or other never got round to rewriting.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. So I take it then that Aristotle's theory of substance is not being resurrected in your thinking. So what remains really is his intuition that the intellect is somehow not part of the physical world.
As John Church knows, I do resurrect it in a certain context. Mm-hmm. Aristotle, when he wants to illustrate what a substance is, he chooses artifacts because the teleology, what they're for, is very obvious for them. And in natural objects, well, you know, what are dogs for exactly? They have natural ends, though. They're sort of teleological in some sense, in a way that rocks are not. Now, if you think of the whole of the world as a divine creation, then you might want to say that from the perspective of the creator, just as a clock works mechanically, but nevertheless it's put together with a teleological purpose, you might be able to see the world in that light. As John knows, I try to develop a version of transubstantiation in a Berkeleyan context on the basis of that. But that's not to do with, as it were, philosophy of nature, okay, in the ordinary sense.
Thank you. We have another question from Rob Hoverman. The lack of physical limits to thought, its apparently infinite flexibility, seems central to your argument concerning the immateriality of thought. But is there not another aspect to thought which challenges materialist or physicalist monism? Isn't the intentionality of thought also a challenge to materialism, physicalism? How can mere matter reach beyond the present to the past or the future, or that which is not spatially present?
Right. I don't necessarily want to say infinite flexibility, by the way. Not limited in any specific point, so to speak. Yeah. Yes. Now, I suppose I would want to connect that with the grasp on meanings, how meanings work. It's because you understand certain kinds of things as being a sentence with a certain meaning. I did this yesterday. That you can, so intentionality and meaning, and therefore an understanding, are very closely connected. I don't know how you could have, I mean, Tim and I have had sort of discussions or cross-purposely a bit about this. I tend to use intentionality to be in a context where you talk about an intentional object. In other words, a kind of version of singular reference, where there can be singular reference to things that don't exist. But another sense of intentionality, anything with meaning, has intention, not just extension. It's what the word red means is independent of how many red things there are. So it's an intentional notion, not an extensional notion. And yes, so it's in the same box as meaning, and meaning is being a semantic engine, or vice versa. That okay, Rob?
Yes. Yes, I suppose it's just, I suppose it does return to your central point, which is that if it's just motion and matter in motion, I should say, then it's not clear how just matter in motion can produce something which somehow reaches beyond, as it were, what that matter in motion is touching in spatial terms. It's, you know, how can mere matter think about the past, or, you know, just things which are abstract or whatever? And I suppose that is, it's just the way that you formulated the argument seemed to be about, you know, so for example, the sphex-ish wasp has an inflexibility to its action, but it's not clear to me that you can describe some kind of intentionality in that broad sense to it, just a rather limited kind in its intelligent action, so to speak, in paralyzing finding the grasshopper and cricket and paralyzing it and taking it back and what have you. So that, as it were, even rather primitive forms of intelligent action could be seen to be intentional in this broad sense.
It partly is going to depend. I mean, the clock tells the time, but it doesn't know that's what it's doing. In what sense does the sphex know what it's doing? Now, if it's, yeah, goodness knows. And whether a panpsychist might have a different view on that, I don't know.
But then the quarks know what they're doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, Philip gave this remarkable paper to the Aristotelian Society just before things closed down in March, in which he said that things like quarks, he thought all causation was agency. And so it was all done with free will. So elementary particles, let's take an electron, choose to exercise the power of mass and charge that they have all the time. There's nothing else they can choose to do, but nevertheless, it's a free act in some sense. On the whole, I don't think this idea went down all that well. But yes, I mean, one of the difficulties for panpsychism, in my view, is apart from sticking it in the consciousness in order that it may show up later in more complicated things, it's not clear what it's doing at the bottom level. I mean, is it responsible for the behavior of the thing? Does a certain feeling explain why electrons are negative and have a certain mass? Or is it just like a Lewisian quiddity put there to fill a gap? And you might as well fill it with something that's going to turn out to be useful further down the road, which is really the Eddington and, well, certainly the Russell motivation, I think.
If there are any panpsychists in the audience, please come to the rescue of your ideology. We have a hand raised.
I'm just curious about one thing which is not so related to the paper, but I cannot help. I have to ask it. What's the relation with this whole idea about the irreducibility of intelligence and particularly libertarian free will? I have the impression they are heavily related, because if someone accepts cognitive determinism, he or she could construe a counter argument, something along these lines, that, you know, human cognition is deterministic. This is the first premise. Second premise: every deterministic kind of process or every deterministic cognitive process can be described in a syntax engine way, and the conclusion would be that, you know, although it seems that it's very flexible and things like that, it is just an appearance, just a seeming. Actually, it is not flexible at all, because in an actual case, your cognitive apparatus has to do what it will do. So this flexibility is in a metaphysical sense is just an appearance. So I would like to ask you whether there is a connection between the irreducibility of the intellect and libertarian free will, and second, whether this kind of counter argument in principle could be interesting or anything like that.
When I started off as a graduate student in Nottingham for a year in 1967, the first thing I chose to work on was free will, and changed to the mind-body problem in the next term. I've always wanted to go back to the free will problem once I've solved the mind-body problem. And that is the plan for I've just put a book into OUP, which they've just taken, on perception and idealism, and I want to write the next one on free will thought and embodiment.
I see.
Now, what you've just said is this, and I have a lot of sympathy with this. If something can be modeled deterministically, there's no reason why something that's a physical machine shouldn't be able to do it. That's in effect what you've said, isn't it, more or less? And I think I'd like to think that is right. And perhaps I'm committed to thinking it's right from what I've already said about the intellect, which is, thank you for pointing that out. It seems, I mean, you get a certain kind of what we'll label Freudian mentality, which thinks if you stick enough conditions in, you can get psychological determinism.
Yes.
But I think you can show that the language of that kind of thing is not such that it could ever be made deterministic. You can show tendencies, preferences, inclinations, and all the rest of it. You can never get anything deterministic. And if you said, well, okay, you've got the psychological level, so to speak, and then it's made deterministic by sticking in extra bits of neural facts.
Yes.
I think that kind of explanation only works for things if on the level of the neural facts alone, if you put them all in, you'd get determinism.
Yes. Yes.
You can't. Yeah. So I think it's, unless you are a eliminativist or an interpretationalist or an epiphenomenalist about the psychological level, you're committed to libertarianism of some sort. And that's a line that I do want to pursue, and I've tried out a little bit. So yes, I think I share your instincts on this point.
And what about identity theories? I mean, what about Lewis or guys like that? Who identifies mind states with physical states, or cognitive processes with physical processes.
But two of my books have been about that. I mean, there's Matter and Sense, 1982, on the smart, Armstrong, and eliminativism and all that kind of stuff. And then the 2016 from knowledge arguments to mental substance, is discussing all that. I mean, I just don't think that works. I don't think it works for knowledge reasons, roughly speaking.
Okay.
There's certain properties it can't assimilate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who has another question or follow-up?
Yes, thank you. I would like to come back to the hylomorphism issue. So I would think that one of the standards where contemporary hylomorphists rely on Aristotle is to provide an answer to Mereology. So they are dissatisfied with, you know, all kinds of answers to the methodological problems, like universalism and nihilism and whatever is in between.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I agree with you that that is not going to solve the hard problem. I'm not even sure that it's meant to solve the hard problem. It's meant to solve the problem about how the macroscopic world can exist at all. And to that, it seems to me that Aristotle, a kind of Aristotelian hylomorphism, seems to me a good answer, namely that there are forms. Forms are understood as principles of organizations. And it's not emergentism, which I never understood, by the way, or this bizarre notion of downward causation and things like that. And its metaphysical background is not emergentist at all, because emergentists are emergentists, so they think that there is a kind of primacy of the microscopic, and when it becomes complex enough, then something mysteriously emerges, which then strikes back, so to say. So that's the emergentist picture, which is I mean, in comparison to that, Aristotelian hylomorphism seems to be a much more reasonable answer when you say that there are different ways of organizing matter, and the macroscopic organization in some sense primary, because there is no microscopic behavior without some kind of macroscopic organizations to be present, or at least you can't understand some of the ways in which the microscopic behaves without having microscopic objects. And that doesn't seem to me to be either, you know, outdated or non-scientific or anything like that. And I think that, you know, this is a big issue, but the question is to which extent we have to give a Cartesian understanding of matter or material processes and things like that, and not that much, as you said, Descartes' conception of the mind is not so different from Aristotle's, at least as far as the intellect is concerned. Of course, Descartes would disagree with the animals or plants having mental properties. So in this sense, it's very un-Aristotelian, but the intellectual part may be very similar to Aristotle. But Descartes' understanding of matter might be super simplifying, and maybe it is there are reasons to turn back to some kind of Aristotelian hylomorphism to understand how the world as we perceive it can exist and operate, and, you know, things like that. That's, of course, not an answer to the hard problem in a sense, but that's a different issue. But I saw that many Aristotelian hylomorphists actually are hylomorphists because they think that that gives you the best answer to this simple question: how macroscopic reality is possible at all?
Well, if the let's call them atomic bits come together in a certain kind of way, they can hang together, and if they come together in other ways, they fall apart. Right. So there are some combinations that are secure and some that are not. And if you take a sort of evolutionary view of that, it's a matter of trial and error. You know, you start off with a mud, so to speak, a swamp, and then things begin to coalesce and some work and some don't. It sounds, if you're going to be a hylomorphist, I would have thought you're not merely saying that some structures are stable and some aren't, which seems to me all you have to say in order to explain on the basis of a more primitive physics, so to speak, how you get more complicated things happening. But I take it that form is not just a name for those structures that are stable. It's something about what it is that makes them stable. And I'm not quite, so I really don't understand how the people you're talking about, which may include you, are using the notion of form.
I mean, I would think that the form is the explanatory principle of the matter. So it's explanatory. So why do you think it's just, I don't know what you said exactly, but so it's, I mean, the crucial bit is that it's an explanatory principle, and it certainly was an explanatory principle for Aristotle. It's only through the forms that you can make sense of the organization of matter. No, there is no other pure matter has no organizational principle whatsoever. So I don't see that why don't you see the real work done here?
Well, certainly we need concepts like that in order to make sense of things. But the notion of explanatory is different from the notion of actually having a causal role.
Well, not for Aristotle. Sorry for interrupting. He's absolutely explicit about that. The explanation and causation, the four forms of explanation, four forms of causation. When he comes to the syllogistic argument of explanation, he says that the upper premises are the major premises are the causes of the thing, and then they actually represent the causal structure of the world. So, okay, I understand that the post-positivist way of explaining explanation is that it's all pragmatic, but it's not for Aristotle.
I wouldn't call it post-positivist.
I would, but or simply positivist, okay.
Well, it's a bit older than that. But at the beginning of early on in the paper, I discussed Vlastos's claim that idea were just the four becauses of and not just the four causes. And I raised the issue, does that mean that the motion and distribution of matter could be explained purely, or could be accounted for, purely in terms of the operation, say, of efficient cause or efficient and material cause? Or are the other causes necessary for that? Now, if the motion and distribution of matter can be explained in terms of, say, just efficient cause, then the others are just modes of explanation for certain purposes. They're not actually influencing the motion and distribution of matter, how it's put together. And I think Aristotle thinks that all four causes have a role in the latter.
Yes.
And therefore, that's the sense in which they are causes. Now, of course, if you want to explain something, you refer to them because they are among the, let's call them forces, principles that are determining how things are arranged in the world, not just what sense we make of it or how it's convenient for us to conceptualize it and all the rest of it. And if you move on to a sort of kind of conceptualism, which when Anna Armaduro spoke at Fordham, she admitted that would be her interpretation of Aristotle, or at least what she wanted to keep from Aristotle. It's more or less Lockean. it's more or less Lockean. I mean, Locke doesn't deny that you need these sortal categories in order to explain things, but he doesn't think that they're doing any extra causal force. So that's the distinction that is important to me.
So if can I have the last word, and then I leave the other people to talk. So all this presupposes that you have a clear notion of efficient causation without having the other notions of causation, which I doubt. So I think you can't have it. And second, it's also built on the idea that physics, as we understand it now, is really does a lot with causation. I think it almost has got almost nothing with causation. So basically the physical laws which you use in order to understand the distribution of matter had very little to do with the notion of efficient cause. And therefore, I think that, in fact, this is it's not just my view, there are other philosophers who think that, but I sympathize with those who argue that causation is an emergent notion, not in the sense in emergentism, but in the sense that unless there is a macroscopic world, you don't have causation at all. So so at the microphysical level, the notion of a cause is a very useless, efficient cause is a very useless concept. So maybe that's where we really disagree. Well, I think that this idea that if you can explain everything by efficient causes, yes, but you can't. That's my point. You can't.
Now, I don't think we do disagree about this.
Okay, so much the better.
You're making the issue now very complicated.
I'm sorry.
No, I don't blame you. I don't think it makes any difference to the point that I'm making. I mean, so I don't disagree, say, with Russell, who thought that causation, laws of nature aren't causal laws, they're laws which tell you how the world unfolds, so to speak, rather than how A influences B. And I agree that we apply that kind of explanation. It's very selective. We choose out of the general flow of events the bits we're interested in to explain other bits that we're interested in. Yeah. Now, I don't think that can be used to reinstate Aristotle's philosophy of nature, but that's clearly going to take us into a lot of other issues. I mean, I would think, for example, if you believe that physical nature, forget about the mind for a minute, unfolds according to Schrodinger's equation, which is a deterministic equation, if you don't mind postulating all these other worlds, then that's in a sense not causal, but it does account for the kinds of processes which underlie what we think of as causal goings on. And it certainly doesn't require any teleology and any forms. Now, I agree, if we couldn't apply our sortal categories to the world to try and understand it, we couldn't cope. That's absolutely right. I don't think you
can... I have more to say about this, but I probably should wait.
No, feel free to. We don't have any questions in the queue, so please go on.
Well, I don't have any problem. Of course, there are lots of things here about physics, and I'm not saying that I have a special expertise in physics, but basically the physical, first of all, every physical law is just derivable from the law of conservation, different conservation laws, which has nothing to do with causation, neither they determine any specific distribution of the matter. And the kind of process laws which you mentioned, they seem to me, but this is really for us or for Danny to to make it clear. The process laws, it's not quite clear to me that you can make sense of them without some kind of teleology, to be honest. That's not that I want to be teleological about the basic level of physics, but even so, if I just want to be really honest to myself, I just don't understand how process laws are not teleological. I just don't understand. So it is not quite clear to me why it is irrelevant. I mean, and just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should restore Aristotelian nature of Aristotelian view of physics. I don't think that stones have a natural tendency to move downwards. In fact, I don't think that it makes much sense to talk about downwards as a you know, a clear, given relativity, a clear, it's not a clear concept anymore. So I'm not saying this, that we should restore Aristotle. We have different kind of laws, different kind of understanding the physics, but I don't think that the Aristotelian kind of conceptualization, what we do when we do physics, should be discarded as it is usually discarded by most you know, post-Cartesian philosophers of physics or philosophers of nature. So that's what I would be more cautiously committed to. And efficient causes play much less role. It's basically, it's efficient causes are, I think it's, I call it once, and then I called it once first, and then when I read Collingwood, I realized that he said the same thing. So I was very proud of myself that it's an engineering concept. So it's
Right.
not, it's not the concept for, you know, theoretical understanding of the world.
Well, I suppose what I would want to claim, and I'm putting it that way because I'm not going to say that you'd think I'd got an argument for it, is, sorry, the same points of the the same anti-Aristotelian or anti-Hylomorphist points could be made in terms of whatever you think of as being the right way to state modern physical science.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I just mentioned this because you mentioned efficient causes, and you know, challenge me that if I imagine the world such that it would be just all combinations of atoms moving determined by efficient causes, blah blah blah. That's why I said that. So I think that there is no way to understand the relationship between the microscopic and the macroscopic world without some sort of Aristotelian form business, and there is no way to understand the microscopic without the macroscopic. And if you accept these two premises, it follows that there is something to the Aristotelian picture. You don't have to accept it. I'm just telling you what's my motive. So what's my view?
I know that Rob Koons thinks, that I've not read his stuff in detail, that
I don't know him, unfortunately. So
yeah, he's Austin, Texas, and a philosopher of physics, and metaphysics as well. He thinks that you need hylomorphic ideas in order to understand quantum theory, but you wouldn't if Newtonian atomism was correct. But really, this is quite a difficult area to pursue. I'm not hostile to the idea that we can only understand things from the point of view of the macroscopic down. That's obviously right, because that's where we are.
Yes, that's where we, you know, our role of nature we see differently. I think we are part of the nature. We are not look at it from the outside and interpret it. So, but you know, these are.
I don't know that I was committed to any strong view of that kind of just what I said. I mean, we are macroscopic objects, so to speak. No,
I mean our rational capacities as well. So not just as macroscopic. But anyway, really, I went too far. So sorry.
No,
I wouldn't say that.
Thank you for this extended exchange. Unfortunately, we are running out of time now. So I think I'm going to thank Professor Robinson for agreeing to this. Thank you very much.
There's no need for formality.
Thank you, however. It was good to see you.